Hello again, friends! We're delighted to welcome you to the continuation of the New Me team's exciting journey through Egypt. Just 2 days ago, we boarded a very comfortable overnight train from Cairo, traveling 660 kilometers up the Nile to Central Egypt, the legendary city of Luxor, once the capital of the ancient kingdom. Luxor greeted us with wonderfully mild and warm weather. Finally, we realized just how lucky we were to have chosen January for our Egyptian adventure. Here, we settled into a stunning villa with breathtaking views of both the Nile and Akhenaten Mountain, home to the Valley of the Kings. To be honest, we are utterly amazed by the high quality of services provided here, as well as the friendliness and attentiveness of the villa hosts. They happily answer all our questions, assist the transportations and arrange excursions. Nowhere else have we experienced hospitality and service quite like in Luxor. This city has undeniably become our favorite. The name Luxor, or Thebes as the Greeks called it, drawing a parallel with their own Thebes in Boeotia, since they identified the supreme god Amun with their Zeus, actually has no direct connection to Egypt. To the ancient Egyptians, this city was known as Waset, the Mysteries, as all cities in ancient Egypt were depicted as women and given feminine names. Waset was a magnificent goddess who, together with the city's chief deity Amun, upheld the power to the pharaoh and fostered the prosperity of the Egyptian kingdom. When the Arabs arrived, they were struck by the number of monumental structures in the area and named the city Al-Uqsur, meaning the palaces. Traditionally, the Nile divided every Egyptian city into the eastern bank, the city of the living, and the western bank, home of tombs, mortuary temples, and necropolises, the city of those who had passed into eternal life. But Waset was uniquely significant for the Egyptians. According to legend, it was here that the celestial Mediterranean passed, the body of the goddess Mut arched over the world. Here stood the most sacred sanctuary of the kingdom, Ipet-Isut, the most sacred of places, the temple of the god Amun. Amun was the ancient deity, regarded as a primordial cause of life, the creator who gives birth to the sun, the god of destiny and a great protector. Pharaohs would come here to seek his blessing for victory in war. In a smaller shrine within the temple, a humble farmer or craftsman could pray to avoid misfortune and injustice in their lives. Once again, we encounter the fact that the modern name Karnak Temple has no connection to the original essence of this place. The word Karnak derives from the Arabic for fortified market, where camels were traded. For the ancient Egyptians, however, this site was heaven on earth, or the Hill of Wonders, as it was home to awe-inspiring constructions that defy imagination. For over 2,000 years, priests performed religious rituals in this temple. Each pharaoh, high priest or dignitary aspired to leave their mark here, whether by building a new structure or at least placing their statue within its sacred grounds. To ensure their name would endure to eternity. Yet this honor was reserved for the chosen few. Over time, the sheer number of statues became overwhelming, and older sculptures were carefully buried beneath the temple to make way for new ones, sanctifying the ground even further. What a treasure trove for modern archaeologists who occasionally uncovered those hidden caches containing sounds of statues. Of course, this grand temple does not look as impressive now as it did in ancient times, when its walls were covered in colorful reliefs, and the tops of its columns and obelisks gleamed in the sunlight, coated in gold and electrum, an alloy of gold and silver. Unfortunately, over the past 2,000 years, the temple has suffered significant damage. It was buried under layers of sand, and local inhabitants dismantled its stones to build their homes, disrupting the perfect ancient structure designed to withstand any cataclysm. Today the temple occasionally suffers from earthquakes as well. Yet even in this semi-ruined, sun-yellow state, stripped of its gold and vibrant decorations, it still impresses with its beauty and grandeur, and we can still uncover its fascinating history. And it all began right here, in the oldest and most sacred part of the Karnak Temple, its very heart, which for many remained shrouded in mystery. This was where the kingdom's greatest treasure was kept, the golden statue of the god Amun. But it would be a mistake to think that the Egyptians were naive or primitive enough to simply worship statues. Of course, they did not believe that the figure made of gold was their god. However, during special rituals or festivals, the essence of the god could manifest in the world of the living, inhabiting the statue that represented him. And by touching our world, the god brought grace and prosperity. The statue was golden, not because of the value of the metal. On the contrary, thanks to their own minds, Egypt had an abundance of gold, and it was not as highly priced as it is today. Instead, gold was used because it did not lose its beauty over time. Gold did not tarnish or rust, making it a symbol of imperishability. Golden statues and masks signified the imperishability of flesh and thus the immortality of their owner. This is the oldest part of the temple, the main sanctuary, built during the Middle Kingdom around the 20th century BCE by the highly successful pharaoh Senusert I, who strengthened the state economy and ensured the prosperity of the entire country. Unfortunately, only the foundations of his sanctuary have survived to this day. But let us trade the path of the god Amun and explore what other fascinating wonders his devoted subjects built in this incredible place. We step out of the Holy of Holies and into the central hall of the Bark. It has been rebuilt so many times that what we see now is a Macedonian version, very non-Egyptian, yet still impressively beautiful. Here we even find the traditional starry sky, which the Egyptian called Ah. For us so far, everything in Egypt feels like a true Ah. Once the bark of the god Amun stood here, carrying his statue as it left the temple to travel to another locations. Today only the base of it remains. This sculpture belongs to the great queen Ahmose-Nefertari, the mother of Pharaoh Amenhotep I, who lived at the end of the 16th century BCE. She became the first high priestess of the temple, established numerous festivals, and founded a school for priestesses and musicians, which earned her deep reverence from the people for centuries. After the death of the childless Amenhotep I, the throne passed to his half-brother, Thutmose I, who founded the dynasty of great Thutmosides in the New Kingdom. The renowned architect Ineni constructed stone pylons here for his king, with niches containing statues portraying the pharaoh in the guise of the god Osiris, lord of the afterlife who triumphed over death. According to legend, when Osiris was king, his brother, the god Set or Setech, tricked him into a chest and cast into the Nile to seize power and rule himself. Osiris's wife Isis, learning of this, set off in search of her husband's body. When she found it, she hid the chest and went to her sister Nephthys for help. Nephthys' son, the god Anubis, who held the secrets of embalming, was to assist them. However, during this time, Set, while hunting nearby, discovered the chest, saw his dead brother and tore him into pieces, scattering them across the land. Isis, Nephthys and Anubis gathered nearly all the parts, except for the phallus, which has fallen into the Nile, explaining in Egyptian beliefs the extraordinary fertility of the river. They molded a new phallus from clay, which is why Osiris is often depicted with an erection. and Anubis helped create the first ever mummy. Having undergone 13 transformations, Osiris awoke and became the god of the afterlife, while his wife Isis was able to conceive a son, Horus, who would later become the king of Egypt. Every subsequent pharaoh was considered the incarnation of Horus on earth. Thus, by portraying the pharaoh as Osiris, the Egyptians associated him with the god who triumphed over death and was reborn into eternal life. The name of the Thutmose I's daughter, Queen Hatshepsut, should be familiar to everyone. Initially, she was not a queen, but like many of her predecessors, married her brother, Thutmose II. Due to his frail health, he was unable to govern effectively, yet he was the heir to the Egyptian throne. When he passed away shortly after their marriage, leaving only one son by a concubine, Queen Hatshepsut decided not to relinquish the throne to her stepson, Thutmose III, and instead ruled independently. Her reign lasted for 22 years, years of greatness, splendor, and remarkable success for all of Egypt. Traditionally, a woman could not hold this exclusively male position, as it was believed that only a man could convey the breath of eternal life granted by the gods and embody the god Horus on earth. Thus, Hatshepsut began ruling as a male pharaoh, depicting herself in statues with a traditional ceremonial beard. She participated in the renewal festivals as a man, yet she remained a woman, a queen, the great Ma'at-Kara, and the wife of the god Amun. This duality made her reign even more provocative. Hatshepsut built many structures in the Karnak Temple. However, her most remarkable masterpieces are undoubtedly the two massive obelisks and the Red Chapel. In ancient times, the chapel was dismantled and its stones repurposed for other constructions. However, French scholars managed to retrieve those fragments and restore the chapel, which now stands in the open-air museum. As for the obelisks, there is rather amusing story associated with them. When Hatshepsut passed away, Thutmose III, whom she had excluded from power, finally ascended to the throne. Considering her reign illegitimate, her good deeds were swiftly forgotten, and efforts were made to erase the fact that a woman had ruled. Her names and images were chiseled off reliefs, and statues were destroyed, not with a great zeal, but rather out of necessity. However, Thutmose decided not to destroy her obelisks. Instead, he embedded them within gates and erected his own obelisks in front of hers. Ironically, the gates preserved Hatshepsut's obelisks, while Thutmose's own obelisks later broke apart and now exist only as fragments. By the way, there is nothing mystical about how the Egyptians erected these enormous obelisks made from solid granite. They were simply pulled into a pit between two large ramps and then gradually straightened using ropes. The pit was filled in, and the portions that remained above the ground was carved with reliefs and covered in gold and electrum. That's all. No magic, no alien intervention, just the daily heroic efforts of workers. Thutmose III, who finally ascended the throne after Hatshepsut's death, was also a highly successful ruler and a great conqueror, bringing all the Phoenicia, Palestine and Nubia under Egyptian control. In addition, he was a brilliant builder, an intellectual, and deeply interested in temple architecture. Here, on this wall, you can see a list of gifts he presented to the temple: obelisks, bowls, captives, precious stones, weapons. He reconstructed the coronation hall of Wajid, created by his stepmother, and established the so-called Hall of Annals, dedicated to his ancestors, the kings of the 18th dynasty, depicting their history. To demonstrate their divine authority, Thutmose III erected two massive granite pillars, adorned with heraldic flowers. papyrus, a symbol of Lower Egypt, and lily, a symbol of Upper Egypt. About the lily, the name of the king, the great Thutmose III, is engraved, while on the sides of the pillars, reliefs depict god and goddesses embracing him. About half a century later, in the 14th century BCE, another prominent king, Amenhotep IV, constructed what is now known as the third pylon of the temple, counting from the main entrance. His son, Amenhotep IV, who would later become famous as Akhenaten, did not add anything to this temple. What's more, he nearly destroyed all the cultural achievements of his predecessors. You can see the traces of his reign here, on the fragment of Hatshepsut's obelisk. On the Pyramidion, Hatshepsut is shown as a male pharaoh kneeling before the god Amun. However, the image of Amun appears deliberately erased, and his name is partially destroyed. This is a direct result of Akhenaten's radical religious reform, when he banned the worship of Amun and all other gods, commanding everyone to revere a single solar deity, Aten. Akhenaten ordered the obliteration of Amun's images and names. However, subsequent pharaohs, determined to restore Egypt's culture, brought them back to life. Even Akhenaten's famous son, the young king Tutankhamun, whose golden mask is highlight of the Cairo Museum, has a presence here. In statues, he and his wife are depicted as Amun and his female aspect, Amunet. As the ultimate creator god, was believed to embody both masculine and feminine qualities. Alongside his wife Mut, he also possessed a feminine side of his own divine essence. These two facets of Amun are captured in the figures of Tutankhamun and his wife Ankhesenamun. Although Tutankhamun ascended the throne as a 9-year-old boy and died at the age of 18, he managed to accomplish quite a bit during his 9 years of reign. Generally, it's important not to judge Egyptian rulers by modern standards. They often marry at the age of 11, 12 or 13. Akhenaten, for example, began constructing his great new city, Amarna, dedicated to his sole god, when he was about 17. By that time he already had several children. At just 17, he forced his people to adopt a new faith, executed priests and nobles who refused to comply, and began building a new capital. Considering the average lifespan was about 30 years, they truly started acting early. However, there is a significant issue with the Tutankhamun. Almost everything he built, created or even planned was claimed by the pharaohs who succeeded him. His statues, pylons, tomb, mortuary temple, and even the concept of the grand columned hall in Karnak were all appropriated. As a result, it is often said that Tutankhamun did nothing noteworthy, simply because his name is nowhere to be found. But if you start digging deeper, analyzing the faces, elements of clothing and ornaments, you'll see that some of his successors distinguished themselves only by ordering Tutankhamun's name to be replaced with their own. That's it, and suddenly the masterpiece belonged to them. And Tutankhamun? What Tutankhamun? Oh, him? No, he didn't do anything significant or noteworthy. Horemheb, Tutankhamun's military commander, was particularly eager to claim the young king's achievements. After the Thutmose dynasty died out without heirs, Horemheb seized power and showed no scruples. It is highly likely that he even took possession of Tutankhamun's luxurious tomb, which remained unfinished due to the king's sudden death. This explains why Tutankhamun was buried in a tiny tomb consisting of a few small chambers, where all the necessarily ritual items were simply piled up in haste. Fate played a cruel joke on Horemheb. To legitimize his rule, he married the beautiful sister of Nefertiti, Mutnejmet. But no matter how desperately she tried, straining her body to the point where by the age of 38 she had lost all her teeth and developed severe cavities in her bones, she could not bear him an heir. The throne was once again left without a successor. Seeing the chaos of a throne repeatedly passed to unrelated rulers, the priest decided to choose a family capable of founding a strong dynasty with numerous heirs. Their choice fell on Horemheb's chief vizier, Paramesu. Although Paramesu was not a native Egyptian descent, his ancestors came from the Hyksos. His family was known for its distinctive red hair and aquiline noses. However, his name sounded too provincial, so the article Pa was dropped, transforming it into Ramesu or Ramses I. Ramses I, however, was already so old that he reigned only for a year or two before being succeeded by his son, Seti I, who already had several almost grown children. Among them was none other than Ramses II, Ramses the Great. When they actively took up work on the Karnak Temple, the project for the Grand Hypostyle Hall had already been laid out. An idea initially developed by Maya, the architect, treasurer and closest friend of Tutankhamun. However, it was Seti I and Ramses II who completed the construction and made the hall truly extraordinary. The hall houses 134 massive columns, reached up to 21 meters in height. The Hypostyle hall symbolized the primordial marshes of Ahbit, which emerged from the ocean of chaos, when nothing exists, only the ocean in total darkness. But then, in the darkness of creation, amidst great papyrus thickets, represented by the columns, a water lily bud appeared. On its open petals, the sun god was born, illuminating the entire world with his light. Thus, the central columns represent open papyrus stems, always bathed in light, while the outer ones symbolized closed buds, which remained in near total darkness. All the columns were brightly painted and topped with a sheet of gold. The reliefs on the columns glorified Ramses II, whom the god Amun was believed to have rewarded with eternal life for creating such unparalleled beauty. In the centuries that followed, many pharaohs sought to lay claims to this monument. Inscriptions were often replaced. At the very top, where access was difficult, inscriptions by the Ramses II. In some places, Seti I have been preserved. Lower down, one can see changes from the 11th and 12th centuries BCE, made by Ramses IV and Ramses VI. The lower reliefs were covered so deeply that they could not be altered in the future, ensuring that no successors could claim ownership of what had already been appropriated. Most of the scenes here are primarily dedicated to royal coronations and celebrations. For example, here is the coronation of Ramses II. The king sits on his throne, while the goddesses Nekhbet on the left and Uajit on the right, as the great ancestors of Upper and Lower Egypt, unite the forces of the country under the king's rule. Horus and Thoth place the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt upon his head. Interestingly, compared to the refined reliefs of his father, Ramses II seemed more focused on quantity than quality. As a result, there are numerous reliefs featuring his image, but they lack the elegance of those created during Seti I's reign. Once, many statues of queens and kings stood between the columns. However, almost all of them were removed. Those that couldn't be transported were simply broken, with even the heads being taken. This wasn't done by mere vandals, but by museum workers from all over the world, who now proudly display those heads in their exhibitions. Honestly, it wouldn't hurt to knock their heads off instead. During the reign of Ramses II, the temple's second pylon was constructed. There is an amusing story associated with it. In the 19th century, to prevent the pylons from collapsing, massive wooden supports were installed. They looked incredibly unsightly and ruined the entire aesthetic. Once, the German crown prince visited the site. Upon seeing this absurd construction, he exclaimed, "Who is the barbarian who did this?" He was told that it was created by the German engineer. A long pause followed, after which the crown prince remarked, "Even though he was German, he was still a barbarian." In the courtyard behind the first pylon stands the grand colonnade of Taharqa. Imagine not just a single column, but an entire colonnade, brightly painted and covered with gold leaf. Taharqa was a king of the dark-skinned Nubian dynasty that took control of Egypt during a period of crisis in the 7th century BCE. However, since the Nubians revered Egyptian gods and followed the same beliefs, sometimes even with greater fervor than the Egyptians themselves, they supported the temples, saved ancient relics and manuscripts, and overall diligently preserved Egypt's glorious history. There was no roof here, but during festivals, sacred embroidered fabric was stretched over those columns to shelter the sacred bark of Amun, which was brought out of the temple and briefly placed on this platform. You can also see preserved colossi of Ramses the Great, alongside one of his favorite daughters, Bint Anat. After her mother's death, she participated in temple rituals, as queens had specific ceremonial duties in the temple. These sculptures resemble sentinels guarding the sacred space of the temple beyond the second pylon, hidden from prying eyes. Imagine a divine procession taking place here during the festivals. Priests would carry the sacred bark with a statue of Amun from his sanctuary. Following it were the barks of the goddess Mut and the god Khonsu, making their way towards the river. Priests and priestesses played musical instruments, while above them sacred fabric fluttered on Taharqa's painted columns, and the ground was covered with fragrant flowers. Isn't it magnificent? Subsequent pharaohs, eager to immortalize their names, built small mortuary chapels here to serve as resting places for the sacred bark on its journey from the temple. By visiting those chapels, the god Amun would remember the names of those kings and grant them immortality and eternal life. To the left is the temple of Seti II, 12th century BCE. And to the right is the temple of Ramses III, 11th century BCE. These temples were exceptionally beautiful and ceremonial, with grand colossi of the kings standing before them. The temple of Ramses III has preserved its pharaoh's colossi, and upon entering, one can see the pharaoh depicted as the god Osiris, as mortuary cults were performed here. The Sphinx of Tutankhamun, which once held an offering table, has also been well preserved. As you can see, the blending of different times and eras constantly occurred here. Some objects were moved or relocated, earlier statues were hidden in caches, and new ones appeared in their place. Yet everything harmoniously coexists and continues to astonish with its grandeur. Here you can also see how the ancient Egyptians constructed their monuments. The first pylon was never completed, as the later Ptolemaic rulers lacked sufficient funds. Because of this, the earthen ramp used to haul stones to the top remains alongside the unfinished pylon, 4th century BCE. It was with such ramps that they built the pyramids, carved columns, and lifted stone blocks. The columns of Pharaoh Sheshonq II also remain unfinished, making their layers clearly visible, showing how they were constructed. The processional avenue of sphinxes with ram heads accompanies us as we leave the temple, along with the bark of the god Amun. The ram was one of Amun's most significant sacred animals, alongside the serpent and the sacred goose. These symbols mark the ruler to whom this holy temple belonged. Similar avenues were created near many temples, as sphinxes were regarded as divine guardians, protecting sacred spaces from evil spirits. Their muscles on leonine bodies appear tense, their broad foreheads and mighty horns poised for battle. In just a moment, they could unleash their formidable claws. No army of evil would dare pass through such a line of defenders. The procession ended at a grand quay, where Amun's magnificent ceremonial ships used to carry his sacred bark were docked. Unfortunately, this beautiful quay is no longer here, leaving this area looking quite barren. But in ancient times, fragrant plants grew here, and sacred gardens were created with acacias, sycamores, and papyrus thickets. A man-made lake bloomed with blue lilies. However, you can still see remnants from Roman times. These circular structures are baths, where people came to perform purification rituals. They cleansed their bodies and souls before presenting themselves to the god Amun. Well, it seems we've exited the temple along the central axis, but in fact there is another axis, perpendicular to this one. It leads to separate temples dedicated to the god Khonsu, the triad of Ptah, Sekhmet and their son Nefertem, and goddess Opet, the war god Montu, as well as the residential quarters of priests and priestesses. And despite the annoyed look on my cameraman face, we'll have to turn back so I can show you my favorite part of the temple. If we return to sanctuary of the god Amun and proceed a bit further, we will discover the remarkable Hall of Annals, built by Thutmose III, who was denied the throne by Queen Hatshepsut. This area is called Ahmenu and was designated for royal festivals. Unfortunately, during early Christian times, the first monks chose this place as their residence. They built nothing of their own, but destroyed ancient structures with particular cruelty, scraping paint off the columns to crudely carve images of their saints, or breaking parts of Thutmose's quartzite triad with Amun and Mut to form a cross. True vandals. However, the 19th century vandals were no better. They arrived with documents as museum representatives from various countries and cut out entire reliefs, transporting them to museums at great cost to the original structures. For example, the French removed a relief listing the names of 61 pharaohs who ruled before Thutmose III, whom to honored as his great ancestors, and took it to the Louvre. Another incredible part of Ahmenu is the hall known as Botanical Garden. After Thutmose III's 40 military campaigns, the Egyptians discovered new lands, unusual plants, animals and birds. Everything they saw was depicted on the walls of this sanctuary, symbolically offering those exotic natural wonders to their gods. The sacred lake of Karnak was originally created during the reign of Thutmose III, but attained its final form in the 7th century BCE under the Nubian king Taharqa. This secret lake never dries up, as it is fed by its own source, unconnected to the Nile. Near the tribunes, where tourists now enjoy evening light shows, once stood the homes of the ordinary priests who served the Karnak Temple. Several times a day they came to the lake, descended these stone steps and performed ritual purification. At night, the lake hosted mysterious of the gods' lives, performed on sacred barks. Do you see this small opening in the wall? This is the underground entrance to the sacred goose house of the god Amun. Geese were sacred animals and lived here freely, using underground passages to move between the goose house and the temple. In the courtyard, a part of Hatshepsut's obelisk has been preserved. The sacred scarab beetle, created in the 14th century BCE during the reign of Amenhotep III for the king's mortuary temple, was later moved here by King Taharqa when he introduced new solar rituals. For the ancient Egyptians, the scarab symbolized self-creation, so they produced countless scarabs of various sizes and materials. These beetles served as seals and amulets. Warriors carried them into battle, remembering they might die at any moment. They were worn on necklace, placed on the chest of the deceased instead of a heart, and depicted on sarcophagi and sacred barks. Scarabs were also used to convey information, with inscription often written on their underside. This granite pedestal depicts the three primary aspects of the sun god. The scarab symbolizes Hapri, the god of the morning sun. The circular shape of the stone itself represents Ra, the sun at its zenith. On the side panel, Atum, the evening sun, is depicted. Guides in Karnak often entertain tourists by encouraging them to run around the scarab with shout and laughter, promising that it will aid in quick conception. Strangely enough, even men join in, making the spectacle all the more amusing. However, this monument has nothing to do with conception. It embodies the complete power of the sun god, who sustains human existence during life and grants rebirth and eternal life after death. Throughout Karnak, one can see deliberate indentations in the stone. These date back to the late Middle Ages, when Egyptian women, both Muslim and Christian, came to the ancient sanctuary with knives to carve out pieces of the temple's flesh. They would mix the stone dust with flour, bake bread and eat it, believing it would help them bear a son. This was considered a sacred ritual carrying divine blessings. However, the inscription on this wall has nothing to do with blessing or conception. It depicts Roma-Roy, the high priest of Amun and his son. Kings in Karnak had their grand achievements. Some built pylons, erected obelisks and statues, or dug sacred lakes. High priests had fewer opportunities to leave their mark. But in the 12th century BCE, Roma-Roy built a new bakery in the temple. He left this inscription for future generations, urging them not to destroy his creation and to remember him with gratitude whenever they tasted the bread. Such inscriptions are abundant in Karnak. They are not always about gods and kings. Sometimes they tell stories of ordinary people from Karnak, who also sought to leave a memory of themselves for eternity. In the central part of the temple lies a perpendicular axis directed southwards towards the presence of the temple of the Goddess Mut, the great consort of Amun. If you pass through the area scattered with fragments of walls and obelisks, pieces that Egyptologists are painstakingly trying to resemble into complete monuments, such as the walls of Tutankhamun's palace, you will find one of the best preserved temples, the Temple of Khonsu, the moon god and son of Amun and Mut. During early Christian times, monks lived here and blackened the walls with soot, turning the courtyard coal black. However, this black layer, due to its density, preserved the original colors remarkably well. Thanks to the American researchers, the courtyard has been restored, allowing us to see the vibrant paintings and imagine the splendor of the entire Karnak Temple complex. Unfortunately, with the arrival of Christianity and later Islam in Egypt, all the ancient temples were closed. The old festivals were no longer celebrated, and even the sacred Egyptian language, Medu Nature, was lost forever. The civilization that created this temple and its unique art gradually faded away. Yet, even today, Karnak remains a great sanctuary, vividly reflecting the face of the ancient Egyptians. It's not just a hypostyle hall, statues and obelisks that glorify the names and grandeur of kings, but also the voices of ordinary Karnak residents that speak through inscriptions on the walls. Karnak embodies the entirety of Egyptian history. More than 30 pharaohs left their marks here as testaments to their power. To this day, this magnificent temple complex continues to stand as a legend.